Hello everybody, in this video I'm going to be outlining the difference between a jointer, a planer and a thicknesser. Because in the US they call it a jointer, but then in the UK they call it a planer.
Shut up a moment and let this curly head thing.
Hang on, have you looked at the state of your... Hey. You guys done? Cool. Let's get going. So before we even look at the machine, we're going to bust some jargon, if that's even a thing whatsoever. So there are two machines that you need to make wood square, flat, true, and just all lovely, ready for you to work on at a later date. Now, the problem is, for these two machines, there are three names for them depending on where you're from. In the US, you've got a jointer and a planer, with the jointer being the one where you pass the wood over the cutter block, and the planer being the one where you pass the wood under the cutter block. We'll come to this later. However, like I just said, in the US, they call the planer the one where you passing it under. In the UK, we call the one where you're passing the wood over the cutter block the planer, and the one where you're passing it under a thicknesser. So if you've watched a lot of YouTube videos where it's the UK and US and you're kind of just mixing and mingling and all that, you may have noticed that we use the term planer completely different. So in this video, what I'm going to do is get rid of the word planer completely, because that's where our blurred lines are, and I'm going to take the US version of the machine where the wood is passing over the block, and that is going to be called the jointer, and the UK version of when the wood is passing under the block, which is called a thicknesser. So we've got a jointer going over, a thicknesser going under the cutter block. And providing my instincts don't kick in and I say the wrong word, the word planer will not be mentioned whatsoever, and thus this video will be nice and easy for everyone to follow. So this is my machine here, which is a combined jointer and a thicknesser. So as a quick recap, once again, a jointer is where you're passing the wood over the cutter block like this, and a thicknesser is where you're passing the wood under the cutter block, which is actually going through this section here. The shroud under here folds over, and I'll show you it later. Now, the difference of passing wood over a cutter block and under a cutter block doesn't really sound like it will make a lot of difference, which is what confuses a lot of people. But if you don't follow the things I'm about to share with you in this video, it will make a massive detrimental effect to your dimension timber. So starting with a jointer, this is used to plane one side of your material completely flat, no twist, no bow, no cup whatsoever. And this is done by applying light force to your timber from above and passing it over the cutter block. Now you'll notice how I said light force when you're pressing down on top of the timber as you're passing it over the cutter block. Because if you apply too much force to the top of the timber as you're passing it over the cutter block, you'll see that you're just able to press the distortion out of it. So we've got a bow in this material at the moment. If I press down really hard, I can actually get that flat on the table. And this can be a problem because as you're passing it through, if you're really pressing down on top, as soon as you take the pressure off on this opposite side, the material is just going to spring back up like that. Yes, you may have pressed that face into the cutter block and got it nice and clean and everything, but the internal tension of this timber that you've pressed out of it while planing that face, that tension is just going to cause it to spring back up, and you're not going to be left with a flat board. And this is just one example I've given you where the material is bowed along its length like that. Sometimes you get material that's cupped like this, especially when it's through and through sawn or crown cut, whatever you want to call it. If it's bowed up like this, it's possible to press that out of it, send it over the cutter block, get it nice and cleaned up, but then as soon as you take that pressure off it, whoop, it bows back up and you're left with that cup shape again. So it's very, very important as you're passing this over the planer to apply light force to it and make sure that you're not pressing out any distortion. The job of this machine is just to take off those little high spots here and there and be very precise with it. Now this is the exact reason why you wouldn't use a thicknesser to plane a board flat. Because as I lift up these tables, you'll see that we've got two feed rollers under here which are going to apply a lot of pressure to the top of the material as it's passing through the machine. So here we go, this is what the inside of my thicknesser looks like before you fold up the dust shroud like that. So that will clip over the top normally, but this is what we're looking at for the time being. So we've got the cutter block in here, which I've got a helical head. If you haven't seen one of these before, I did a unboxing video on this, which I'll put a link to in the top corner now, and also I used it in a video where I just cut up a log and planed it flat and everything. So on a side note, if you want to see how this performs, be sure to watch that video. But we have the cutter block here, and you'll see just poking out the side here, there's one feed roller, and then underneath this one here, there is another feed roller. And the job of these rollers is to carry the material through to make sure that it doesn't jump around inside the machine, and it keeps it nice and stable and pressed down against the bed. And that's the key word there. It keeps it pressed down against the bed. Exactly what we don't want to be doing when there's already distortion in the board, because all those feed rollers are going to do is press any cup out of it, take the top of the material down and make it nice and clean, but then as soon as it comes out the other side, the cup's just going to come back up. Exactly the same if it's bowed. It's going to come through the front, the feed roller is going to flatten it out, it'll clean up that top face, and then the tension within the board it's just going to cause it to bow back up again. The other thing you may encounter is snipe. So let me just fold this over. So we're now looking inside the machine. You can see the first feed roller here, which is very heavily corrugated, so that grips the material. Got the cutter block here, and then we've got the second feed roller here, which is very nice and smooth. So after the cutter block's taken its pass, it's going to have a nice smooth surface carrying it through. Whereas if the serrated surface carried it through on the opposite side here, after being cut, it's just going to put loads of serrations in it. So end snipe would happen if, when you're putting the material through the thicknesser, it's bowed down like this. Because what it's going to do, as it comes through from your side there, it's going to be carried through by the feed rollers, and that first feed roller with the serrations on it is going to be pressing it nice and flat. But there's a lot of internal tension within that board. So as soon as it passes that first feed roller, it's just going to shoot up into the cutter block like that, because the tension in the board was being pressed out by that feed roller. Now there's nothing there supporting it, it's just going to jump up like that, and you're going to take off more material on the end of the board. It's quite hard to explain here, but it's quite obvious to see when it happens. So that's what happens if the material is bowed upwards, and if the material is bowed downwards, exactly as I said earlier, it's going to carry it through like that. The feed rollers are going to press it nice and flat, and then as soon as it comes out the opposite side, it's just going to bow back up into an arc. So in conclusion, if you were to use a thicknesser instead of a jointer to initially prepare your timber, yes, you might get a lovely clean face on the top and the bottom of the material, but what you're not doing is getting rid of any of that distortion. As soon as it takes that cut, it's just going to spring back up into its initial position, whether that was bowed, cupped, and even twisted as well. If along its length it's kind of doing this sort of thing, again, that's just going to follow the bed and twist as it goes through. As soon as it comes out the other end, you've got a clean bit of material, but otherwise in exactly the same condition as it was before. So let's joint one of these edges nice and flat. It's so difficult for me to remember to say joint and not say plane by accident. I'm determined not to confuse any of you guys. I know some Americans do call it a thickness planer, which makes it somewhat easier because at least you've got the word thicknesser in there. Unfortunately, us in the UK don't call it a joiner planer or anything like that. God, actually, that would really confuse things, wouldn't it? So I think just for clarity purposes, I'm going to do exactly as I said earlier about pressing too hard on top of the timber, and I'll show you that you're able to get a clean face, but it's still going to be bowed at the end of it. So look at this, by actually pressing too hard on the timber, I think I've made it worse. Look at the size of this bow we've got going on here, because I was just pressing it down into the cutter block, making it nice and flat, but then the tension within the board just springs it up like that. This face is lovely and clean. Cutter block's done a really nice job on it, but it's not flat. So now we'll do it with light pressure, making sure that we're not pressing that bow out of it whatsoever. Of course, you still want enough pressure on there to stop it from being shot back by the cutter block. Literally just enough pressure on here to make sure that it stays on the bed, but no more than that. There we go, look at the difference of that. It's sitting perfectly flat on the bed of the jointer, no bow in it whatsoever, the face is nice and clean, and yeah, that is ready to go to the next stage. So just to recap on this real quick, the jointer's job is to get rid of all the distortion, be that cups, bows, twists or whatever, by passing them over the cutter block. Your only job at this point is to press forward and push it over the cutter block. The machine's job is to do all of the hard work for you. Don't feel like you need to help it by trying to press any of that distortion out of it, because the only thing it's going to do is hinder you. Now the other thing a jointer can do is get one edge perfectly square to this face that we've just planed, or sorry, that we've just jointed. Oh, close there. I feel like I've made loads of mistakes up until this point. So this is the fence. It's at 90 degrees to the bed. That face that we've just jointed, that is now going to press up against the fence, and you can pass it through at 90 degrees like that. So let's do that real quick. So now we have a bit of material with perfectly flat face and a perfectly flat edge that is square to that initial face. So we'll just swap it back around to the thicknesser now. So this is another limitation of just using a thicknesser to plane your wood perfectly square. Because as we've just seen, the jointer is able to get that edge perfectly square. A thicknesser, there's no square reference face in here apart from these sides here, but then there's no cutter block, and that's proper dodgy, that. The only way to do the edges through the thicknesser would just be to go for it and put them through like that and hope that it turns out square. But what you might be able to see on this edge is that it's sloped off a little bit to the left like that. So if I put that down on the bed, It means that this material is going to go through at an angle like that, and the cutter block being above this timber is going to also plane this edge at an angle like that as well. It's literally going to copy whatever's happening on this bottom face here and transfer it to this top edge here as well. So that's why it's important that this edge on the top here is squared off first before putting it through the thicknesser, because now that's going to go through at 90 degrees and it's going to take this edge down to 90 degrees as well as it passes through. So up until this point, I've pretty much just been slating the thicknesser, telling you everything that it can't do and why you can't use it to plane wood flat and square and why it can't get rid of cups and bows and all that kind of stuff. And you're probably thinking to yourself now, well, hang on, why don't I just get myself a jointer then? Well, let me show you the reason why you can't do that. We've got a brand new bit of timber here, lovely bit of oven coal, offcut from the guitar project, and we're going to plane, we're going to joint. We're going to joint all 4 faces of this nice and flat and make sure there's no bows or anything in it, and we'll see what we're left with. So we've been left with 4 perfectly flat faces, lovely and smooth, no bows or twists or anything like that. The edges are nice and square. You can even check them. Yeah, it's looking pretty good until it comes to measuring it. So let's check this end. This one is 79 millimeters and this edge here 71 millimeters. So along its length, this has got 8 millimeters thinner. Also, let's check the thickness of it as well. So this is saying just under 19 millimeters. And this edge here is 16 millimeters. So we've lost 3 millimeters along its length here as well. And the reason this has happened is because we haven't been referencing off our initial side that we've jointed. We've simply just been attacking it on the top like this. It's done a great job at getting rid of all those high points and getting everything square. But what it hasn't done is made it parallel. So in a complete extreme example, if you had a completely trapezoidal shape or a pyramid or whatever, you could put each face of that pyramid over this block and it would get them nice and flat. There'd be no high points on them, but that pyramid is not parallel whatsoever. It's quite the opposite. So this, at long last, is where the thicknesser comes in use. Oh, you're probably bored of watching me swap this around by now, aren't you? So a thicknesser does exactly that. It takes things down to thickness. Flip this over. Oh, yeah, totally forgot to turn on the extraction. Oops. So what I've done on this timber is labelled a face side and a face edge, because I'm happy that this side's perfectly flat and I'm happy that this side is perfectly square to that. So whenever I put this through the thicknesser now, I need to make sure that either the face side or the face edge is pressed down on the bed, and the cutter block is either taking off the opposite edge or this edge here, which doesn't have any of the markings on them. And so now, after going through the thicknesser, if we measure this, 70 millimeters there, 70 millimeters there, so perfectly parallel. And in terms of the width, we went down to 12 millimeters and 12 millimeters. So it's perfectly flat, it's not bowing whatsoever. The edges are perfectly square to that face. And finally, it's parallel along its length and thickness. And at this point, it's worth me saying that if your thicknesser doesn't have a particularly large capacity from top to bottom, sometimes you might struggle to thickness that opposite edge to make sure it's perfectly parallel to the bottom one here that you want to lay on the bed. In cases like this is where you want to be using a table saw, for example. So the process would be you joint this edge perfectly flat and then you make this edge perfectly square to that face while on the jointer. Then you'd thickness that down so it's parallel to the opposite edge, and then to sort this edge out, you'd put your jointed edge up against the table saw fence and then push it through, and the saw blade would make this edge parallel to the fence that you're referencing from here. You could also do this on a bandsaw by setting the fence up and sending it through like that. So jointed edge pressed against the fence, and then as this blade cuts through, it's making it parallel to that. But on a bandsaw, the blade tends to wander a little bit, so it's not going to be as good as a table saw at getting it parallel to this edge. But if you set this up well enough, which again I showed you in the video cutting up a log, if you get it set up good enough, then it is still pretty good at making that edge parallel. You've just got to do a little bit of cleaning up with a hand plane or something afterwards. So in conclusion, as another recap, a jointer passing the wood over the top of the blade is for getting rid of any distortion in the board, be it a cup, a bow or a twist along its length. The jointer, by passing it over the top, is going to get rid of all that, providing you put light pressure on it. If you press down too much, it's just going to keep all of that distortion in there due to the tension inside the wood. A thicknesser, which is when you pass the wood under the blade, is for making sure that the opposite faces to your two jointed faces that you did on top are perfectly parallel. If you don't use the thicknesser and opt to use the jointer instead, those edges are not going to be parallel whatsoever, as we saw on this piece as I sent it through. So if I had to choose one of these machines, if I absolutely had to choose one of them, I would opt to go for a thicknesser first. And the reason for this is because the thicknesser does the grunt of the work, which is exactly why I chose machines in the first place. It's not because I can't do this sort of stuff by hand, it's because I can't be bothered. So a thicknesser does all of the dirty, heavy work for me, whereas the jointer kind of does all the precision bits. So it's taking off those high points, making sure that the board's nice and flat before sending it through the thicknesser and taking off like 10 millimeters. Like in a thicknesser, you could take off 10 mil in about 5 passes, taking off 2 millimeters at a time. Whereas if you were to try and thickness 10 millimeters off a board by hand, whew, that's going to take you quite a long time and a lot of effort as well. Whereas if you just needed to take off a few high points here and there and get an edge square, that's a lot easier to do by hand, and you probably wouldn't need a jointer. But jointing an edge flat takes a little bit more thinking and a few well-placed plane strokes, but overall, it's not a whole lot of effort. And like I say, it's because I can't be asked to expend that sort of energy. So yeah, as an overview, the jointer is for the precision sort of work. Takes a little bit more thinking up here, but overall in terms of physical effort, easier to do. Whereas thicknessing is kind of just pure effort if you're doing it by hand with a little bit of precision at the end where you're just trying to fine tune it. Yeah, I'm kind of just going off on one. If I was to choose one machine, go for a thicknesser, do the jointing by hand. So if you want to see how material is jointed and prepared and thickness by hand entirely, then you can watch my video series on how to make a chopping board entirely by hand. Link is in the top corner, but if your hand tool skills aren't particularly good, or you don't have a lot of faith in them, or you can't be bothered, other ways to replace the jointer on top of this machine is to use something like a router sled, for example, which there are plenty of videos out there on how to do. That will allow you to get one edge perfectly flat, no distortion in it whatsoever. The only thing that won't be able to do is get an edge square to that flat face, which is what you'll be able to do with the fence on the jointer here. And you can also make like certain jigs and things, so you can put distorted material through the thicknesser because the jig supports the distorted bits from underneath and prevents the feed rollers from pressing the distortion out of it. But as with all things in woodworking, there are a lot of ways to do essentially the same thing. The point in this video is just to show you the difference between the jointer and the thicknesser. But yeah, I hope that cleared up any questions. Of course, if you have any further questions, feel free to chuck them in the comments below, and either myself or one of my other lovely commenters will be sure to answer that for you. But otherwise, thank you for watching. See you in the next video.